Hey everyone, welcome to a bit of a different kind of video. If you're used to my gameplay content and my streaming content, then this video might be a little bit of a change of pace for you. But I've had this thing on my mind for a very long time and I wanted to talk about it. For those of you who don't know, I've been working in the film industry since 2015, and during that time, I've seen a lot of changes. Some good and some pretty concerning, and I think this is worth discussing. So today's video is going to be about how political ideologies have changed the film industry today, specifically from the 2010s up till now. This isn't something brand new, by the way. We've seen similar patterns in the past, most notably during the Blacklist Hollywood era of the 1950s, what we are referring today as the McCarthyism era. But what's happening today with things like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion feels like it's taken an even more dangerous turn. And the consequences of radical ideologies are playing out in front of us, and much like during the McCarthyism era of the 1950s, we're seeing careers ruined and creativity stifled under the guise of inclusivity. Let's start by going back in time to the 1950s. The Cold War was at its highest between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. And the threat of communism was a huge political talking point in America. This fear of communist influence in every aspect of American life led to what we now know as McCarthyism, named after the Senator Joseph McCarthy. So what was McCarthyism? McCarthyism was essentially a political movement that sought to root out communist sympathizers from positions of influence, especially in Hollywood. The entertainment industry was seen as a potential vehicle for spreading communist propaganda, which led to a witch hunt for anyone even remotely connected to leftist ideologies. So the impact of McCarthyism during that time made Hollywood a place for creative freedom at the time, became a battleground between ideologies, or specifically the idea of anti-American ideology. The mere accusation of being sympathetic to communist ideas could result in someone losing their job and being blacklisted from the industry forever. We're talking directors, actors, screenwriters, people behind the camera all fell victim to this rampant fear of communism. And people were forced to testify in front of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and those who refused or were suspected of communist ties found themselves on the infamous Hollywood Blacklist. One of the most famous being Dalton Trumbo, an award-winning screenwriter who was blacklisted for his alleged communist sympathies. Frankly, it didn't really matter whether he had communist sympathies or not. The mere label alone destroyed his career. And for years, Trumbo wrote scripts under pseudonyms and couldn't take credit for any of his work until much later in life, pretty much after McCarthyism was over. What McCarthyism and the Hollywood Blacklist showed us was how powerful fear could be in shaping the narrative and silencing opposition. It took years for the industry to recover, and even then, the damage was done to the careers of countless artists who never came back. Of course, eventually, filmmakers fought back. They started pushing boundaries, telling stories that reflected the complexity of the human experience rather than towing the political line of the time. Films like Spartacus and High Noon were among those that helped Hollywood finally reclaim its voice. And these films that I just mentioned, these were human stories that really just reflected history. But what these movies also did is that they took risks. They weren't just about promoting or resisting any particular ideology. Frankly, they were about telling stories that resonated with audiences. Spartacus is about liberation, and High Noon is about having to do what must be done even though no one's gonna help you. The Blacklist era, or the McCarthyism era, started to finally wane, as public sentiments, the audience, shifted and decided not to stay silent. But the scars it left on the creative landscape serve as a stark reminder of what happens when politics and art became too closely intertwined. And unfortunately, it hasn't reminded enough people because we're seeing the scars of what McCarthyism did today. We're seeing the same happening now. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing something strikingly similar, though under a different name. Instead of McCarthyism, we now have DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these initiatives that are shaping the entertainment industry. Now let me make something clear. I'm not against diversity and inclusion. I think they're both important, but there's a way to do it that enhances storytelling rather than taking away from it. The problem arises when DEI becomes less about inclusion and more about enforcing a specific ideological narrative. Much like McCarthyism rooted out suspect communists, today's DEI culture roots out those who don't align with, well, what we have started calling the woke agenda. If you don't toe the line, you risk at being labeled a bigot, a racist, or any number of derogatory terms that essentially serve the same purpose as labeling someone a communist in the 1950s. This label doesn't just hurt your reputation, it can destroy your career. In Hollywood, we've seen actors and directors and producers and anyone being ostracized for having opinions that don't align with the DEI narrative. And what's particularly troubling is that this modern blacklisting that we are calling canceling is happening across multiple industries, not just film industry, also happening in the video game industry. Developers, content creators, and players who speak out against certain ideological pushes in games are often labeled as hateful or intolerant. And much like in the McCarthy era, where people were too afraid to speak out of fear of losing their jobs, many in today's film and gaming industry remain silent because they fear being labeled or blacklisted. We've reached a point where criticizing a film or a game that has been shaped by DEI principles automatically puts you in the crosshair. Whether the criticism is valid or not doesn't seem to matter. What matters is that you're not supporting the right narrative, and that's where the danger lies. This environment of fear and ideological purity tests stifles creativity. See, the best art, whether in film, television, or video games, or even comics, comes from creators who are free to explore all aspects of the human experience. But when certain viewpoints are off limits or deemed unacceptable, you end up with bland, one-dimensional stories that fail to connect with the audiences. I'm sure that you've all seen a film, a TV show, or even a game where it feels like characters were added simply to check a box rather than to serve the story. That's when you know that the storytelling has taken a back seat for ideology. And audiences, well, we can all sense this. See, audiences, they know when a character or plotline is there to serve the narrative and when it's there to serve an agenda. The latter often falls flat because it lacks the emotional depth and complexity that makes a story resonate with people. But again, this isn't just an abstract political debate, it's impacting real people in the industry. A perfect example of this is what happened with Gina Carano. Gina Carano is an actress who played Cara Dune in the popular TV show called The Mandalorian. And she was fired by Disney after she made some politically charged comments on social media that didn't align with the current dominant ideological narrative. Bear in mind, whether or not you agree with her views isn't really the point here. What matters is that she was essentially blacklisted, cancelled, and fired for having an opinion. Her acting ability didn't matter, whether she was good or not, and clearly she was popular, had no say. Disney claimed that her views were abhorrent and didn't reflect their values. And what it boils down to is that she was fired for expressing ideas that didn't conform to what was then the popular narrative of the time. And here's the thing, Carano isn't the only one. There have been several actors, directors, producers, and creative professionals who've been fired or ostracized because their views didn't align with the DEI agenda. And again, whether you agree with their opinions isn't the point. The point is that their ability to work was taken away because they didn't fit the ideological mold. But what is really scary is the stories you don't hear. The stories that are not about Gina Carano but are the same ones that you don't hear about at all. People behind the camera who works in more less known titles. Gaffers, assistant directors, associate producers, producer assistant, editors, sound mixers, people who have been fired who are not well known as Gina Carano or these other actors, directors, and producers who have a renown throughout the world. These people you've never heard of, they're gone forever. And this is really sad. This is truly sad. their reputation is ruined. They've been labeled bigots, racist, or whatever label that they obviously do not deserve because they might have criticized DEI initiatives, or perhaps they've criticized politically correct movies. Their stories, what they can bring to the film industry, their talent, their merit, it's all gone. And unlike these DEI-driven people who keep failing upwards, their jobs are gone. This kind of modern blacklisting or canceling is creating a chilling effect in both film and video game industries. People are really afraid to speak out. In this environment, creators, directors, and, well, others, they walk on eggshells, trying to avoid stepping on the wrong side of the ideological divide. And the sad part is, this fear doesn't just impact individuals, it destroys creativity. And on a larger scale, therefore, destroys the audiences. When the industry is more concerned with pushing a specific ideological narrative than it is with telling a good story, you suffer from this. You, the audience. And ultimately, the industry suffers as well because the audience won't stick around for movies and games that feel like thinly veiled lectures. So more jobs are lost, more people are laid off, and projects are cancelled. This kind of ideological purity test is creating an environment where creators feel they must constantly censor themselves, not just in their work environment, but also in their personal lives. And that's an atmosphere that punishes free thought and honest discussion. And that's a huge problem when you work in an industry that thrives on creativity and innovation. What's even more frustrating is the dismissive attitude that some creators, critics, and showrunners alike have when faced with valid criticism. I mean, we've all seen examples of filmmakers or game developers responding to criticism with comments like, you know, this movie wasn't made for you. Or if you don't like it, don't watch it. Or if you don't like it, don't buy it. This kind of attitude dismisses real feedback and shuts down conversations. And what is even worse is that they preemptively blame you, the audience, for not wanting to watch a TV show that doesn't really resonate with you. I mean, it's kind of feels a little bit fascistic. You're blamed for something you haven't even done from the beginning. Or you're blamed for not doing what they want you to do. And the problem with this mentality is that it alienates you. It alienates a large portion of the audience. When you tell your potential viewers that they shouldn't watch your film or play your game because they don't align with your political beliefs, they are effectively cutting off a huge part, well, of this fan base. And it's a tactic that simply doesn't work. And it certainly doesn't work in the long run. So where does this leave us? Well, I believe, much like in the McCarthy era, we're heading toward a moment of reckoning. People are really getting tired of having ideological messages shoved down their throats, whether in films, TV shows, or video games. Audiences are craving real, human stories that resonates for them. Stories that don't preach, but instead allow viewers to think for themselves. And we're already starting to see pushback. Because when propaganda overtakes storytelling, it always crashes and burns. It's just a matter of time before the industry wakes up and realizes that. So I have, despite talking about what seems to be a very bleak film industry, I have faith in it. I believe in it. I do believe that eventually, real stories about real humans and the audience who want to resonate with these stories will overtake the industry again. Just like it did from the 1950s to the 1960s, throughout the golden era of film, to what I believe was a renaissance for film industry of the late 90s and early 2000s, I believe the film industry is going to survive this, and once again, thrive. But it cannot happen if we're quiet. It cannot happen as long as people in the film industry and the audience themselves stay quiet. So we need to learn to not be quiet. Vote with our wallets. Do not be afraid of calling this out. We need to be able to have a voice like we used to, like we've always had. But this is at least my take about the film industry today. What is yours? Let me know in the comments section what you believe, whether you agree with me or not, whether you believe it's far-fetched, or whether you believe the industry doesn't really have any hope. Thank you for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.